They didn't say it to my face, not at first. They said it in glances, in the way their eyes darted past me when cases were assigned. In the awkward silences when I entered the room, when professors handed back tests and said, "Some people just aren't cut out for this pace." I heard it in my father's sighs during dinner, the kind that settled over the table like dust, silent, heavy, and impossible to ignore. "You think too much," he once muttered, not knowing that thinking had been my only weapon in a world that raced ahead. I was never the fastest. I didn't shine in mock trials. I didn't interrupt or perform. I watched. I listened. And they mistook my silence for weakness, again and again. One afternoon during a seminar, a classmate smirked as I paused to find the right words. "Are you buffering, Amanda?" The room chuckled. I smiled. I always smiled. Because I knew, and they didn't, that every second I spent silent was a second I used to build something stronger than noise. I was slow because I was precise. But that didn't matter in a school that prized speed, aggression, performance. So they labeled me too slow, too soft, too timid. But none of them knew the weight I carried behind each quiet nod. No one asked why I walked with my shoulders tight, or why I never raised my hand unless it was absolutely necessary. And so, they underestimated me. All of them. What they didn't see was the night work, the cases I read alone at 3 a.m., the part-time job I never mentioned, helping my mom pay off her hospital bills, the tutoring I gave other students in secret because it was easier to build others up than prove myself. They didn't know that slow was the only pace I could afford, because collapsing was not an option. I wasn't just fighting for a degree. I was fighting to survive in a world that believed I had already failed, and yet, in all their doubt, I stayed. Every class, every test, every insult. I stayed. Quiet. Focused. Unshaken. And I remembered every name. It was the last spot at one of the most competitive internships in the city. Only one student from our class would get it. The top 5 were invited to interview, and I wasn't one of them. Of course not. Why would they choose the girl who spoke like she was thinking in slow motion? But I applied anyway, not because I thought I had a chance, but because I refused to hand them another reason to laugh behind my back. The day the list went up, my name wasn't on it. But the next day, something changed. I got a call. The original candidate had a conflict. I was next on the list. Barely. I could almost hear the resentment dripping from the administrator's voice when she said, "It's yours, if you want it." I did, desperately, but I didn't show it. I walked in the first day like I belonged there, even if every look I got from the other interns said otherwise. They were polished, loud, impressive. I was invisible, at least at first. I stayed after hours reading every case file they ignored. I organized the archives nobody wanted to touch. I didn't compete. I worked quietly, consistently. The lead attorney, Mr. Dawson, never addressed me in the morning briefs until one Friday, when he threw a file across the table and said, "Let's see what the slow one can do with this." It was a mess. A custody case with incomplete records, missed deadlines, and no obvious path forward. Everyone thought it was a test, a punishment. Maybe it was. But I didn't flinch. I spent the whole weekend tracing connections, rebuilding the case from fragments. Monday morning, I handed him a binder with tabs, notes, and 3 possible strategies. He didn't say a word, just stared at me like he was seeing me, truly seeing me, for the first time. The other interns smirked. They still thought I'd just gotten lucky. But Mr. Dawson didn't assign anyone else a case after that. He kept giving them to me. The binder sat on my nightstand like it was breathing. I couldn't ignore it, even when I closed my eyes. It wasn't just another case. This one had a heartbeat. A woman, Maria, fighting for custody of her daughter after years in a shelter. Her ex had money, lawyers, connections. She had silence, trauma, and now, me. Mr. Dawson had tossed it to me like a challenge, assuming I'd crumble. But I didn't. I read her file like it was scripture. Every police report. Every late-night hospital record. Every missing piece of evidence buried in footnotes. This wasn't theory anymore. This was her life. And in some small, invisible way, it felt like mine too. I met Maria only once, in a room that smelled like stale coffee and cheap air freshener. She didn't look at me when I walked in, just sat hunched, arms crossed, eyes hollow. I introduced myself, softly, slowly. No flash, no legal bravado, just presence. After 10 minutes, she lifted her eyes. "Are you really going to fight for me?" I nodded. I didn't need to say yes. She could feel it. I wasn't there to impress anyone. I was there because I knew what it meant to be discarded. I wasn't a mother, but I understood what it meant to be forgotten and called weak. That night, I didn't sleep again. I reread everything and started building something no one had bothered to build for her before. A narrative. A truth. A story that would make the court feel her pain, not just process her paperwork. I found inconsistencies in the ex's statements, bank withdrawals that didn't match, a neighbor willing to testify, who had never been asked. One by one, I stacked bricks where there had only been rubble. I wasn't fast. I wasn't flashy. But every quiet hour I poured into that file made Maria less invisible. And maybe made me less invisible too. The day before the hearing, we had what they called a war room meeting, a final prep where the interns sat silently while the senior attorneys dissected the case. When it came to Maria's file, Mr. Dawson slid it to the center of the table and nodded in my direction. "Let's hear it." I stood, heart pounding, throat dry. I'd rehearsed the outline 100 times. But as I opened my mouth, one of the other interns, Josh, whispered loud enough for the room to hear. "Hope she doesn't take 20 minutes just to clear her throat." Laughter, snickers, even a chuckle from one of the associates. I didn't flinch. I didn't defend myself. I looked at Mr. Dawson. He said nothing, just waited. And I spoke, calmly, clearly, deliberately. I laid out Maria's case like it was a glass sculpture. Fragile, but whole. I showed them the timeline, the new testimony, the gaps in the father's alibi. I watched their faces shift, one by one. The laughter died. The smirks dropped. When I finished, the room was quiet. Mr. Dawson leaned back, tapped the folder twice, and said, "She's presenting in court." Josh choked on his coffee. Another intern blurted, "You're kidding, right?" But he wasn't. "She's the only one who actually saw the client." I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I nodded once and sat down. But inside, something cracked open. Not pride, not revenge, just presence. For the first time, I wasn't trying to keep up. I wasn't trying to be like them. I was being me. Slow, focused, unshakable. And it was enough. That night, I walked home in silence. No music, no calls, just the echo of my own footsteps. They'd laughed, and I'd stood through it. I hadn't screamed. I hadn't defended. I had shown up, and they finally had to see me. Come from the air, but from the eyes watching you, waiting for you to fail. I stood at the plaintiff's table, my notes trembling slightly in my hands. Maria sat beside me, dressed in borrowed clothes and holding her breath. Across from us, the father's attorney, slick, confident, everything I was not, smirked like he'd already won. "Miss Harlow will be leading," Mr. Dawson said to the judge, surprising even Maria. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Very well. he said, almost with curiosity, almost with disbelief. I stepped forward. The first words nearly caught in my throat. Every voice in my head screamed, "You're not ready. You're too slow. You don't belong here." But then I looked at Maria. She gave me the smallest nod, not desperate, not pleading, trusting. And that's what pulled me out. I began to speak, not fast, not forceful, just steady. I walked the court through Maria's story, not as a litany of facts, but as a path, a life that had been torn apart and pieced back together by a woman who was still standing. I showed the gaps in the ex-husband's finances, the neighbor's statement, the bruises, the silence that no one had dared to question until now. The opposing counsel tried to interrupt, object, shake my rhythm. But I didn't rattle. I didn't match his speed. I held my pace, my truth, my space. When I sat down, the silence in the courtroom was deafening. Even the judge didn't speak for a moment. He looked over the papers, then back at me, and said, "Thank you, Miss Harlow. That was thorough." Maria reached under the table and squeezed my hand. Her palm was warm, steady, and I realized so was mine. I wasn't just surviving in that courtroom. I was commanding it, in my own, deliberate way. The final day of the hearing felt endless. The defense had pulled every trick, technicalities, character digs, interruptions, but none of it shook me. I didn't respond with fire. I responded with clarity. Every time they tried to reduce Maria to a statistic, I brought the court back to her humanity. And when it was done, all we could do was wait. Maria sat next to me, her hands folded tight, lips pressed together like she was holding her soul in place. I didn't speak. I just sat with her. Because sometimes, presence is louder than any promise. The judge returned after what felt like hours. He looked directly at Maria before he spoke. "This court finds that the best interest of the child lies with her mother." The words dropped like thunder in a quiet room. Maria gasped. She didn't cry. She didn't cheer. She just looked at me, her face flooded with disbelief, and mouthed one word, "Thank you." I nodded once, but inside I was unraveling. Not from doubt, from something else. Something like pride, like healing, like proof that everything they had ever said about me was noise. And this was the truth. Outside the courthouse, reporters rushed past me. They wanted Dawson, the firm's name, the headline. Not me. That was fine. Let them chase the light while I held the core. Maria hugged me tight, tighter than anyone had in years. "They said I didn't matter," she whispered. "But you saw me." I wanted to tell her she'd done the same for me, but the words stuck. Some truths don't need to be said. They live in the spaces between actions, in the silence between people who have been dismissed, and who stood up anyway. Together. 2 weeks after the hearing, I received an email that wasn't meant for me. It was part of an internal thread, a conversation between the senior attorneys about rotating new associates into the firm. Someone had forwarded it by accident. My name was there, but not the way I expected. "Harlow. She's not the fast-track type. Smart, yes, but too slow for courtroom velocity." Another wrote, "More of a background asset, maybe research, not litigation." I read the words 3 times. They weren't cruel, not directly, but they were cutting, not because they doubted my intelligence, but because they dismissed my presence. Again, still. I closed my laptop and sat in silence, the kind of silence that presses into your ribs. I had just won a case no one else wanted. I had changed a life, and still, they saw me as not enough, not fast enough, not sharp enough, not loud enough. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't rant. I reread the case file, not because I had to, but to remind myself of what mattered. And it wasn't them. It wasn't their pace, or their categories, or their hierarchy. It was what happened in that courtroom. What Maria said. What the judge saw. What I proved. The next morning, I walked into Dawson's office and placed a letter on his desk. "I won't be accepting the associate offer," I said. He looked surprised, not disappointed, just curious. "You sure?" I nodded. "I'm not made for the background." He smiled faintly, the first real smile I'd seen from him. "You're right. You're made for more." I left the office that day with no job, no backup plan, but with something they had never given me. Certainty. Not the world's version, mine. They had labeled me too slow. But speed doesn't build justice. Presence does. And I had that, in abundance. I didn't launch anything flashy. No grand opening, no press release. Just a desk in a shared space, a second-hand laptop, and my name on the door. Harlow Legal. Not associates, not in partners, just me. The first few months were quiet, almost painfully so. I took on clients no one else would touch. Single mothers, immigrants, people told by the system that they were too late, too broken, too powerless. I saw them. Not just their files, them. And they felt it. Word began to spread, not fast, but faithfully. They came because someone had listened to them. Really listened. And when I spoke in court, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I let the facts breathe. I let silence work in my favor. Judges noticed. Clients trusted. Opposing counsel underestimated, until they couldn't. I didn't need to win every case. I just needed to show up differently, deliberately, fully. There was power in not rushing. There was strength in not performing. And soon, I wasn't working from a shared office anymore. I had a team, small, intentional, made of people like me, people who had been told they weren't enough, and who now knew better. One afternoon, a letter arrived, handwritten, from Maria. Her daughter had just made honor roll. She enclosed a photo, 2 smiles, one proud, one radiant. "Thank you for seeing me before I could see myself," it said. I stared at that photo for a long time. Not because it surprised me, but because it reminded me why I'd started. They told me I was too slow to be a lawyer. But the truth is, I was never built for their version of law. I was built to transform it. One quiet, unshakable victory at a time. It had been nearly 2 years. My schedule was full, my team growing. I rarely thought of law school anymore, or the laughter, the labels, the way they said I didn't belong. Until one morning, a name appeared on my assistant's calendar. Josh Reiner. I stared at it for a moment, unsure it was real. But when the door opened, there he was, older, thinner, still wearing that expensive arrogance like a badge. "Amanda," he said, like we were old friends. I didn't smile. I offered a chair. He didn't sit. "I heard what you've built. Impressive." I waited. People like Josh never came without a reason. His firm was crumbling, merged twice, downsized. He was looking for something more stable, in his words. He wanted in. "You've got something real here," he said. "I'd be a strong asset if you're open to expanding." I looked at him, not with anger, but with clarity. I remembered every whisper, every smirk, every time he made me doubt the shape of my own voice. "I appreciate the interest," I said gently, "but we're not looking for speed over presence anymore." He paused, as if unsure whether I was insulting him. I wasn't. I was being honest. Josh left that day with a handshake, No drama, no revenge speech, just truth. After he was gone, I stood at the window for a long time, watching the city breathe. That moment wasn't about him. It wasn't even about the past. It was about how far I had come, and how far I would go without needing to prove anything. My silence was no longer survival. It was strength. Measured. Intentional. Unshakable. They once said I was too slow to be a lawyer. Now they came knocking, hoping to borrow the very stillness they mocked. It wasn't until the invitation arrived that I realized just how far I'd come. The law school had invited me to speak at their annual alumni conference, the same institution that once labeled me too slow to keep up. I almost declined, not out of spite, but because I didn't think I needed to go back. But something in me whispered, go, not for them, for who you were back then. So I went. I wore the same quiet confidence I'd earned in courtrooms, not couture. I stood on that stage with no flash, no theatrics, just truth. The auditorium was full. Familiar faces, former professors. Even Dawson was somewhere in the crowd. I opened with no clever quote, just a pause, a moment of silence that made the room shift in their seats. And then I spoke, slowly, deliberately. They told me I wasn't built for this, that I moved too slowly, that I didn't belong. But slowness taught me how to listen. Silence taught me how to see. And being overlooked taught me how to build something that couldn't be ignored. No applause, just breath held still. I wasn't performing. I was reflecting, and they felt it. Afterward, students lined up to speak to me, not the loud ones, the quiet ones, the ones who had been told they weren't enough. I thought I had to change who I was to survive, one girl whispered. I held her hand. You don't. Because I didn't. I didn't have to become louder. I didn't have to move faster. I had to hold steady. I had to trust that presence, real, grounded, intentional presence, could move mountains. And it had. They said I was too slow to be a lawyer, but I didn't scream. I didn't fight back. I stood, and eventually, the world listened. Thank you for watching until the end. If you've ever been called too slow, too soft, or not enough, know this. Your pace is not a flaw. It's a foundation. If Amanda's story resonated with you, share your experience in the comments. We read every one of them. And if you believe in quiet power, in silent strength, and in justice that doesn't shout, hit that subscribe button. Because sometimes, the loudest impact is made in silence.